Prejudice still flies first class, even in a world that prides itself on progress and equality. The truth is, discrimination doesn't always come dressed in hate, it often wears the polished smile of privilege, the subtle tone of superiority, or the quiet comfort of entitlement. On that flight, it wasn't about the seat or the ticket class. It was about an unspoken hierarchy that many still believe exists, one where color determines worth, and appearance defines importance. The businessman stepped onto the plane with quiet confidence, not realizing that his presence alone would challenge the fragile ego of those who thought they belonged above him. As he walked down the aisle, some passengers glanced up from their phones, others gave polite nods, but a few exchanged looks that carried more meaning than words ever could. They saw not his achievements, not his leadership, not his decades of hard work that earned him his success. They only saw his skin, and from that single detail, they decided everything else about him. It's a cruel irony that in an age where we celebrate diversity, so many still fear what's different. The businessman found his seat, greeted the flight attendant with a kind smile, and settled in, unaware that his mere existence in that first-class section would stir resentment among those who believed they were more deserving of comfort. Prejudice, after all, doesn't need a reason, it just needs an opportunity. One passenger, seated across the aisle, whispered something to another. They laughed softly, pretending it was harmless. Another muttered under his breath, questioning how someone like him could afford a ticket up here. It's the kind of discrimination that hides in plain sight, unrecorded, unpunished, yet deeply felt. The businessman noticed, of course. Years of experience had taught him to recognize that particular brand of discomfort. It wasn't the first time he had been doubted, underestimated, or quietly mocked. But what set him apart was his response. He refused to let their ignorance define his peace. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the flight attendant approached him, polite but hesitant. There had been a mix-up, she explained. A certain passenger was demanding his seat, claiming it must have been a mistake. The businessman simply looked at her, his calm eyes reflecting both pain and patience. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He handed over his ticket, showing that it clearly belonged to that very seat. The truth was right there in her hands, printed in black and white, but prejudice rarely yields to facts. The complaining passenger, emboldened by assumption, smirked as if justice had been served. What they didn't understand was that prejudice, when unchallenged, thrives on silence, but it also exposes itself through arrogance. Every gesture, every insult, every whisper became part of a performance they didn't realize was being watched. Somewhere on that flight was a witness, someone with both authority and empathy, who saw everything unfold. And as the businessman quietly endured humiliation, the seeds of justice were being sown without his knowledge. Prejudice is not confined to history books or hate groups. It's alive in boardrooms, schools, restaurants, and airplanes. It's in the assumptions we make, the space we think others don't deserve, and the comfort we feel in judging before understanding. The passengers who doubted him saw only what they wanted to see, a man who didn't fit their image of success. They didn't see the entrepreneur who built a company from scratch, the philanthropist who funded scholarships for underprivileged youth, or the father who taught his children that dignity is stronger than discrimination. That's the tragedy of prejudice. It blinds us to greatness. It prevents us from seeing potential in others because we're too busy protecting our own insecurities. On that flight, a man's calm confidence became a mirror, reflecting the smallness of those who tried to belittle him. And though they didn't know it yet, that same arrogance would soon lead to their own embarrassment. But for now, in that quiet tension of first class, prejudice sat comfortably, believing it still ruled the skies. It believed that money and status gave it the right to judge, to exclude, to humiliate. Yet the businessman remained unmoved, his silence a quiet act of defiance. Because sometimes, the most powerful response to ignorance is composure, the kind of strength that doesn't shout, but still echoes. And while others sipped their champagne and exchanged smirks, he sat tall, knowing that history has always favored those who rise above hate rather than sink beneath it. Power doesn't always wear a suit, and authority doesn't always announce itself with loud words or visible symbols. True strength is often silent, composed, and unassuming. On that plane, surrounded by people who believe that wealth and influence could be measured by appearance, one man's quiet confidence spoke louder than any title or nameplate ever could. He didn't flash his credentials or boast about his achievements. He simply carried himself with the calm dignity of someone who knows exactly who he is and doesn't need to prove it to anyone. That kind of power unsettles people who depend on recognition to validate their worth. When the businessman took his seat, his presence alone disrupted the invisible order that some passengers thought existed. They couldn't understand how someone who looked like him could belong in a space they considered exclusive. In their minds, luxury was a privilege reserved for a certain image, a certain skin tone, a certain kind of success that fit their limited view of the world. But real power doesn't seek validation from others. It doesn't need applause or acknowledgement. It resides quietly in self-assurance, in the knowledge that one's value isn't determined by external approval. As he sat there, scrolling through emails, his posture calm, his expression collected, he embodied that invisible strength. Some around him assumed arrogance in his composure, mistaking confidence for defiance. But what they were really seeing was peace, the peace that comes from a lifetime of proving doubters wrong without ever raising a voice. They couldn't grasp that his silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. He had learned long ago that battles fought in anger often leave scars, but those faced with grace leave lessons. The complaining passenger, loud and entitled, believed that power was in dominance, in speaking over others, in demanding what he wanted. He saw the world through a hierarchy he created in his mind, one where status could be displayed and superiority could be performed. Yet, every word he spoke, every demand he made, stripped away his own dignity and revealed his insecurity. The businessman didn't respond in kind because he didn't need to. Power, real power, doesn't need to prove itself in public arguments. It simply exists, steady and unshaken, even when challenged. The flight attendants could sense it too. There was something about his demeanor, his measured tone, his respectful words, the calm with which he addressed even the most humiliating situation, that commanded quiet respect. While others used volume to gain attention, he used composure to gain influence. That difference is what separates authority from arrogance. One seeks control, the other inspires it. He didn't demand fairness, he expected it. And when it wasn't given, he didn't lose control, he let the situation reveal the truth on its own. As the scene unfolded, other passengers began to notice the contrast between noise and calm, between entitlement and elegance. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that the man they had underestimated carried himself with more dignity than the person trying to degrade him. The loud passenger's confidence came from privilege. The businessman's came from purpose. Privilege can crumble the moment it's questioned, but purpose only grows stronger under pressure. That's why even as he was being judged, he never flinched. He knew that character doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand firm. He had faced this kind of moment before, in boardrooms where his ideas were ignored until repeated by someone else, in meetings where his success was attributed to luck rather than skill, in social gatherings where people assumed he was the assistant instead of the CEO. Each time, he chose composure over confrontation, and each time, his quiet strength turned disbelief into respect. It wasn't about pride, it was about control. The control to choose dignity when others expect anger. The control to stay calm when injustice tries to shake your peace. That control is the purest form of power. On that flight, his silence became a lesson to everyone watching. It reminded them that true leaders don't need to occupy the loudest space in the room, they define the tone of it. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his presence silenced others. He didn't wear a suit, but his aura carried authority. Power, in its truest form, isn't about dominance, it's about discipline. It's not about forcing respect, it's about earning it without even trying. Even those who had judged him began to sense it, the shift in energy, the quiet realization that they had misjudged not just a man, but the entire meaning of success. His calmness, his refusal to retaliate, his ability to stay centered in a moment designed to humiliate him, all of it revealed something rare. Power isn't always loud, visible, or celebrated. Sometimes, it's the quiet force that keeps you standing when the world tries to make you small. Sometimes, it's the patience to let time expose truth. And sometimes, it's simply the courage to sit in your rightful place without needing anyone's permission. Silence can be stronger than confrontation, and sometimes the loudest statement a person can make is to say nothing at all. On that flight, as the situation unfolded and the murmurs grew louder, the businessman understood that reacting in anger would only feed the narrative others had already built about him. The human instinct in the face of humiliation is to defend oneself, to speak up, to fight back, but there's a deeper kind of strength and restraint. His silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. It was a way of holding his dignity intact while allowing the truth to reveal itself naturally. The passengers who mocked him expected outrage, because they equated silence with weakness, but they were wrong. Silence is what power looks like when it's too confident to explain itself. As the entitled passenger raised his voice, demanding the businessman move from his seat, the cabin's atmosphere changed. Eyes turned, whispers spread, and tension filled the air. Everyone waited for a reaction, expecting the man they were trying to embarrass to lose control, to argue, to make a scene. But he didn't. He simply looked at the attendant, then at the passenger, and stayed calm. His silence unsettled them more than anger ever could. Because when someone refuses to respond to provocation, it exposes the pettiness of the aggressor. His quiet presence was a mirror, showing everyone on that plane the difference between composure and chaos. Silence in that moment was not emptiness, it was intention. Every second he stayed quiet, he reclaimed the power that others were trying to take away. Confrontation might have won him sympathy, but silence won him respect. It demanded that people pay attention not to his words, but to his poise. It made them question their assumptions. In a society obsessed with reacting, silence becomes an act of rebellion. It breaks the cycle of conflict by refusing to participate in it. He wasn't afraid of speaking, he was choosing when to speak. Timing, he knew, was everything. The loud passenger, growing more frustrated, mistook the businessman's silence for fear. He couldn't see that the man in front of him was controlling the entire interaction without saying a single word. There's something disarming about calmness, it drains aggression of its energy. The more the entitled man tried to provoke, the more foolish he began to look. The businessman's stillness became a quiet contrast that magnified the other's arrogance. That's the paradox of silence. It amplifies the truth for those who are listening closely. For the flight attendants, the difference was clear. One man was loud but insecure, the other quiet but composed. When emotions run high, silence becomes a signal of self-control, and control commands authority. In that silence, they saw who truly deserved respect. The businessman's restraint spoke volumes about his character. It said he had nothing to prove, no need to lower himself to the level of ignorance. His silence became a language of its own, one that expressed confidence, patience, and grace far more effectively than words ever could. In that moment, his stillness was not passive, it was active resistance. Every second he stayed calm was a reminder that power doesn't always need to shout. It can stand tall, breathe steadily, and wait for the world to catch up. Silence can create space, for truth to surface, for justice to unfold, for conscience to awaken in those who witness the injustice. And as the minutes passed, that's exactly what began to happen. Other passengers started shifting uneasily. Some looked away, ashamed. Others whispered among themselves, realizing the imbalance in what they were watching. Without raising his voice, the businessman had already changed the tone of the entire cabin. People often mistake confrontation for courage. But sometimes, courage means choosing peace when chaos is easier. It means knowing your worth so deeply that no insult can pull you out of your center. His silence was not the silence of defeat, it was the silence of wisdom. He knew that anger burns fast, but composure endures. The world may not always reward the quiet, but silence has a way of echoing long after noise fades. It leaves people reflecting, questioning, uncomfortable, and that's where transformation begins. Even as the plane continued to prepare for takeoff, his silence lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Every second without response added weight to his presence. He didn't need to prove he belonged in that seat, his calmness proved it for him. While others measured power by volume, he demonstrated that real influence often exists in stillness. The flight attendant, now aware of the gravity of what she was witnessing, chose to stand by truth rather than convenience. The tables began to turn, not through confrontation, but through quiet realization. That is the strength of silence. It doesn't fight for justice, it invites it. Silence in moments of disrespect isn't surrender. It's a declaration that one's peace is not up for negotiation. It's the understanding that reacting to ignorance only validates it. The businessman's quiet response was not about ignoring what was happening, it was about choosing what deserved his energy. He wasn't there to teach anyone a lesson, yet his calm composure became the very lesson others needed to learn. Silence, when used with purpose, becomes its own form of speech. It speaks to those who have ears to hear and conscience to understand. True respect is revealed under pressure, not when things are calm and convenient, but when moments test our patience, our character, and our principles. On that flight, respect wasn't about titles, money, or social status. It was about how people chose to treat one another when judgment and tension filled the air. It's easy to be polite when the world is watching, but real respect appears when no one expects it. The businessman, quiet and composed, understood that respect isn't given because of appearance, it's earned through integrity. The others on that plane, however, believed that respect was a privilege reserved for the few who looked like they belonged. That moment became a mirror, reflecting who truly understood the meaning of humanity. As the confrontation played out, every word, every action exposed who people really were beneath the surface. The entitled passenger, frustrated and arrogant, demanded respect without offering any. He believed that by raising his voice, he could command authority. But true authority never needs to shout. It is carried by those who stay calm when others lose control. The businessman didn't respond to insults or challenges because he knew something the others didn't. Respect earned under pressure is far more powerful than respect demanded through dominance. The flight attendant found herself caught in the middle, torn between the loud insistence of one man and the quiet dignity of another. Her instincts told her where true respect belonged. It wasn't in the voice that barked orders or made assumptions. It was in the silence of the man who kept his composure, even when humiliated. Respect, she realized, isn't about agreeing with someone, it's about recognizing their humanity, their right to be treated with fairness and decency, no matter the circumstance. That realization began to shift the energy in the cabin. What had started as mockery began to feel uncomfortable for those watching. They could sense the imbalance between cruelty and grace. Respect is not proven by how we treat those above us. It's measured by how we treat those we think are below us. And on that flight, some passengers revealed exactly who they were. The businessman's calmness forced them to confront their own biases. His silence exposed their lack of self-control. His patience magnified their smallness. Under pressure, the masks came off. The loud man's arrogance began to sound insecure. His confidence, once loud, began to falter against the quiet steadiness across the aisle. That's what happens when respect is tested, it reveals truth. For the businessman, respect wasn't something he begged for. It was something he carried with him, a part of his identity. Years of hard work had taught him that dignity is not negotiable. It can be challenged, mocked, or ignored, but never truly taken away unless you surrender it. He had faced countless rooms where he was underestimated, countless meetings where his ideas were dismissed, countless conversations where he was talked over. Yet, every time, he held his ground, not through confrontation, but through the quiet conviction that his worth did not depend on anyone's acknowledgement. That same conviction kept him steady now, thousands of feet above the ground, surrounded by people who didn't yet understand what real respect looked like. Pressure has a way of exposing character. It strips away politeness and shows authenticity. The loud passenger's voice, trembling with anger, revealed fear, fear of equality, fear of losing a false sense of superiority. The businessman's stillness revealed strength. In that moment, their roles reversed without a word being spoken. The man who sought to embarrass became the one embarrassed by his own behavior. The man who was judged proved to be the only one truly in control. Respect under pressure does that. It turns assumptions inside out and shows the truth in unexpected ways. As the plane continued its journey, the tension began to shift. The flight attendants started addressing the businessman with quiet courtesy. Passengers who had watched silently began to exchange uneasy glances, realizing they had witnessed more than just a misunderstanding. They had seen the difference between entitlement and respect. It became clear that the man they had doubted possessed something deeper than money or influence. He had discipline. He had self-respect. And self-respect, when held firm under pressure, naturally commands respect from others. In a world where people often confuse fear with respect, this moment reminded everyone that respect cannot be forced. It can only be inspired. The businessman's patience didn't make him powerless, it made him powerful. His composure was not compliance, it was confidence. He didn't fight for recognition, yet recognition found him. He didn't demand fairness, yet fairness began to realign itself in his favor. The louder the chaos became around him, the clearer it became who truly held control. Every second of that tense exchange revealed more than just prejudice, it revealed perspective. People started realizing that respect isn't about who sits in which seat, it's about how we carry ourselves, no matter where we are seated. The businessman, even in silence, taught an unspoken lesson to everyone watching, that under pressure, true character doesn't crumble, it rises. Real respect is not measured by applause or approval. It's measured by how gracefully one stands when everything tries to push them down. Justice has its own timing, and it often arrives in ways that no one expects. On that flight, as the tension simmered and the arrogant passenger grew more confident in his disrespect, the businessman sat quietly, unaware that the balance was already shifting in his favor. The beauty of justice is that it doesn't rush to please anyone. It observes, waits, and reveals itself when the truth can no longer be denied. The passengers who thought they were watching a moment of humiliation didn't realize they were witnessing the slow unfolding of accountability. Justice doesn't always enter with noise or confrontation, it comes in silence, with precision, at the exact moment it's meant to. As the flight attendants struggled to manage the situation, whispers spread among the passengers. Some looked uncomfortable, others entertained. The man causing the disturbance grew louder, convinced that his social standing or appearance gave him the right to decide who belonged where. But justice has a way of exposing arrogance. It watches quietly as people reveal themselves, and when the time is right, it turns the same arrogance into embarrassment. The businessman's silence was not just patience, it was a pause in which justice gathered strength. Moments later, a senior flight attendant approached. She had been informed of the commotion and came with authority that filled the cabin. Her tone was professional but firm. She asked for tickets, names, and details. The entitled passenger smirked, assuming the situation would soon go his way. But as she examined the tickets, her expression shifted. The businessman's ticket was valid, purchased directly through the airline, with his name clearly listed among the first-class passengers. The other man's, however, was an upgrade, one processed at the last minute through a favor. Justice had been waiting quietly in the details. The mood in the cabin began to change. The confidence on the loud man's face started to fade. The same people who had laughed or looked away now began to exchange glances, sensing that something was shifting. Justice, once invisible, was now stepping into view. The senior attendant turned toward the businessman, her tone softening, an apology beginning to form. Without gloating, without anger, the businessman simply nodded, his calm demeanor unchanged. That quiet moment carried more weight than any argument could have. Justice didn't need him to fight, it only needed time to reveal the truth. The entitled man tried to backtrack, offering excuses, claiming confusion, but it was too late. Justice, once awakened, doesn't return to sleep. Every word he spoke only deepened his embarrassment. The same flight attendants who had hesitated earlier now stood firmly in support of the man they had almost wronged. passengers who had stayed silent began to show signs of discomfort, some even whispering apologies under their breath. Justice had shifted the energy completely, not through punishment, but through revelation. It had peeled away pretense and forced everyone to confront the consequences of their assumptions. Justice has a rhythm. It arrives not when people demand it, but when it teaches the greatest lesson. The businessman didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even seem surprised. His stillness suggested he had seen this kind of moment before. Life had taught him that truth doesn't always need to fight its way to the surface. It simply rises when the noise settles. For years, he had experienced smaller versions of this same injustice in meetings, in interviews, in restaurants, and now here in the air. But this time, something was different. This time, witnesses were seeing it for what it truly was. Justice wasn't just for him. It was for everyone on that plane who had chosen silence over fairness. As the arrogant man was asked to return to his correct seat, the atmosphere grew heavier with unspoken realization. No one clapped, no one cheered, yet the message was clear. Justice doesn't always humiliate, it humbles. The businessman, maintaining his composure, thanked the attendant politely and returned to his reading. He didn't need validation. His victory wasn't in the outcome, it was in how he carried himself while waiting for that outcome. Justice, when delayed, can feel like defeat, but when it finally arrives, it restores far more than what was lost. It restores faith in decency, in truth, in the idea that integrity still matters. Even the passengers who had judged him learned something in that silence. They saw how quickly arrogance can collapse under the weight of evidence. They saw that the quiet man they underestimated had held power all along, the power of patience, the power of truth. Justice doesn't rush because it doesn't have to. It knows that time always exposes what's hidden, and truth always finds its way to light. On that flight, justice arrived not with anger, but with clarity. It reminded everyone that no lie, no bias, no act of humiliation can stand for long when truth has the patience to wait. Justice, when it finally appeared, didn't need grand gestures. It spoke through the smallest actions, the verification of a ticket, the change in tone, the quiet apology. And as the plane finally lifted into the sky, those who had witnessed the scene carried with them an unspoken lesson, that justice may be delayed, but it never forgets where it's needed most. One act of courage can change the entire flight, and sometimes that courage doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from choosing what's right when everyone else chooses silence. On that plane, the atmosphere had grown heavy with tension and quiet guilt. The passengers who had watched, the attendants who had hesitated, and even those who had mocked all felt the weight of what had unfolded. Then came a single moment, a simple act, that began to shift everything. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it carried the force of integrity. One person decided to stand up, to speak, to do what others were too afraid or too indifferent to do. And in that instant, the tone of the entire cabin began to change. Courage rarely announces itself. It often begins with discomfort, the kind that burns quietly in the conscience when we see injustice and do nothing. There was a passenger sitting a few rows away who had been watching the entire scene unfold. He had noticed the arrogance, the disrespect, and the calm endurance of the man being mistreated. At first, he stayed silent like everyone else, hoping it would end on its own. But as the situation dragged on, something in him shifted. He realized that silence, though safe, was also a form of participation. His conscience refused to stay quiet any longer. When he stood up, the sound of his voice broke the heavy stillness. It wasn't angry, but it was firm. He addressed the flight attendants respectfully, asking why the man was being questioned when his ticket clearly showed he belonged in that seat. The cabin grew quiet again, not with judgment this time, but with awareness. His words carried what everyone else had been thinking but hadn't dared to say. That single act of courage exposed the discomfort others had buried beneath politeness. It reminded them that justice doesn't just need witnesses, it needs participants. The businessman looked up, surprised but composed. For a moment their eyes met, one man tired from years of silent battles, the other realizing that doing nothing was no longer an option. Courage is contagious. The moment one person stood, it gave others permission to remember their own conscience. Another passenger nodded, then another spoke softly in agreement. The whispers of approval grew, creating a ripple of humanity across the rows. What had begun as isolation was now turning into solidarity. All it took was one act of courage to shift the balance. The flight attendants, now under the weight of collective awareness, began to act more carefully. The senior attendant arrived shortly after, asking for clarification, verifying tickets, and handling the matter with the professionalism that had been missing moments before. The courageous passenger didn't need to argue further. His action had already changed the narrative. Sometimes courage doesn't win arguments, it changes direction. It reminds people of what's right when the noise of fear and bias tries to drown it out. The loud, entitled man who had caused the scene now found himself surrounded by quiet disapproval. No one shouted at him. No one insulted him. But the silence that followed his humiliation was louder than any confrontation. He could feel the weight of the eyes around him, not in admiration, but in judgment. That's what courage does. It doesn't just empower the innocent, it exposes the guilty without needing revenge. The courage of one person had turned the entire crowd from spectators into silent witnesses of truth. For the businessman, that moment meant more than anyone realized. It wasn't just about being defended, it was about being seen. After countless times of being ignored, underestimated, and judged, that small act of support carried immense weight. It was proof that decency still existed, that humanity hadn't disappeared beneath the layers of privilege and prejudice. Courage, in its simplest form, can restore faith. It can turn pain into purpose, humiliation into hope. Even after the situation settled, the presence of that single voice lingered. People began reflecting on their own inaction, realizing how close they had come to letting injustice go unchecked. Courage often does that. It wakes up the conscience of those who remained silent too long. It reminds them that doing nothing is also a choice, one that carries its own consequences. The man who spoke up didn't gain anything material from his action, but he gained something deeper, respect. Not the kind that's given out of fear, but the kind that's earned through integrity. As the flight continued, the energy had shifted completely. The businessman sat quietly, now treated with the respect he had always deserved. The arrogant passenger kept his head down, his confidence deflated. The man who had spoken up returned to his seat, saying nothing more, his face calm. He hadn't done it for recognition, he had done it because it was right. That's what real courage looks like. It's quiet, selfless, and powerful enough to move hearts without demanding attention. One act of courage had changed everything: the tone, the perception, the atmosphere. It turned an uncomfortable injustice into a silent revelation of truth. It showed that one voice, when used with purpose, can outweigh the noise of ignorance. It proved that courage doesn't need a crowd to make a difference, it only needs conviction. And on that flight, conviction had finally taken flight too, reminding everyone aboard that sometimes, the smallest act of bravery can lift an entire plane of hearts higher than any altitude could.